Okay, more fun with biogeochemical cycling. This time we're going to focus on the carbon cycle. Okay, so carbon is this important background or backbone to living organisms. We're kind of made of carbon along with other things like nitrogen, oxygen, um, phosphorus, hydrogen, etc. But it also has many inorganic forms like in the air and carbon dioxide and rocks, like calcium carbonate, which is limestone, a rock you've likely heard of. And so it's unsurprising to know that carbon comes in many different forms. And some of those forms are inorganic. So, as I just said, those are things like carbonate rocks that we might find in the oceans, or forms of bicarbonate, which is like a carbonate, CO3 bonded with an hydrogen. And they also come in organic forms, like different kind of organic compounds. Glucose, we talked about, is something that's made through photosynthesis, but there's many other forms of organic carbon compounds as well. And then there's also gaseous forms, things like CO2 or methane. So there's lots of different ways that carbon can exist. And as it experiences these different kinds of chemical reactions that transform it, it moves around in the environment quite a bit. So here is kind of a conceptual model diagram that shows some of the main reservoirs of carbon and some of the main pathways of carbon. And so it shows the lithosphere, which is like the rocks, the earth. And so there's 66 million gigatons of carbon in the rocks, and a gigaton itself is a billion tons. So there's a whole lot of carbon that's in rock, which is maybe not a place that you've thought a lot about where carbon might be. And then the carbon that's stored there is that's a reservoir that usually exists or holds carbon for long periods of time. So it has a very long residence time. Other places where there's large amounts of carbon are the ocean, about 38,000 gigatons of carbon there. And then places like vegetation and soil, about 2,000, the atmosphere, over 700 gigatons. And then interestingly, what you can see is these fluxes or these pathways, and we can see that the ocean absorbs carbon from the atmosphere and then also releases carbon from the ocean. But there's a little bit of net transfer of carbon from the atmosphere to the oceans. So we'll talk more about the introduction of human caused extra carbon in the atmosphere. And we know today a lot of that's being absorbed by the oceans, which is why there's a little imbalance there. We also know that primary productivity can absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and photosynthesis can turn that into carbon in vegetation and soils, but also that vegetation and soil is decomposing over time, and that can be accelerated by different kinds of land management decisions. And so we can see how different changes in land use might be changing the way that carbon is moving between those reservoirs. And then we can see over on the right that there's this big anthropogenic, which means human caused flux, which is the mining of this kind of carbon that's within the lithosphere, within the kind of rocky part of our planet. And although it's within the rocky part, it's actually organic compounds, these old, basically, cells and different kinds of parts of cells that have been kind of pressurized and heated over time to form things like gasoline and natural gas and coal, petroleum, etc. And we burn that to release the energy. We capture that energy to do lots of work in our society. And that is causing this net flux of carbon every year of about over 6 gigatons of extra carbon going into the atmosphere every year. And so some of that's being absorbed by the ocean, some of that might be being absorbed by vegetation, but a lot of that's just building in the atmosphere. And so we'll talk a lot about through this class how that change is influencing the way that different kinds of ecosystems work. Okay, so as we just saw in that picture below, there's different reservoirs or pools of carbon. So like in the lithosphere, which contains or includes fossil fuels, but also rocks like limestone, the oceans, soil, organisms, the atmosphere. We can see that there's different amounts in these different pools. So the atmosphere itself is actually a relatively small reservoir of carbon compared to these others. But as living organisms, we interact a lot with the atmosphere. So even small changes in the atmosphere, if they influence the way that carbon is interacting with us and interacting with energy, that can have problematic impacts. And then the residence times of how long carbon stays in these different reservoirs is usually directly related to the size of the reservoir. So bigger reservoirs usually have longer residence times. So carbon that ends up in the lithosphere might be there for millions or billions of years, at least many thousands of years. And the ocean, carbon might be captured there for hundreds of years. In soil, maybe tens of years, decades. And then organisms in the atmosphere, it's usually going to be a shorter period of time. Okay, so what are some of the important carbon transformations that happen as carbon cycles around? When we talked about water, we said one of the main ways that carbon or that water changes is it remains as the same compound, water, but it either heats up or cools down so that it melts, freezes, evaporates, condenses, etc. That causes it to move from one place to another. And when we think about carbon, we're not just thinking about pure carbon moving around, but we're thinking about these different chemical reactions that are happening with carbon as it's bonding and breaking apart from other atoms. And so a lot of times it's those chemical reactions that are driving the movement of carbon from one place to the other. So some of the main reactions are carbon fixation, which is also sometimes called carbon sequestration. And this is basically a process by which CO2 combines with water through the process of photosynthesis to form organic molecules. And then these organic molecules are maybe passed up the food chain, or maybe they're not. Maybe they're just captured in plant cells and plant compounds, but then they're fixed, they're trapped on the landscape or in the oceans for a period of time in that organic form, and maybe they're buried and fossilized, which may cause them to exist for a lot longer than if they're right on the surface and they're rapidly decomposing. So that process of turning inorganic carbon in the gaseous form, carbon dioxide, into an organic compound is called carbon fixation or carbon sequestration. Carbon combustion is the opposite of carbon fixation or sequestration. And that's basically when organic molecules are burned or combusted in the presence of oxygen. So this can either be in our cells after we eat things. This is what we do with our food. But also this can be external. So we can burn firewood or we can burn fossil fuels to try to capture the energy that's released through combustion. And then we can use that energy to fuel our bodies or fuel our factories or fuel our cars. So that's another thing that's basically the reverse. So we're taking organic carbon and then we're turning it back into carbon dioxide. So if we're doing that rapidly, we're building the amount of carbon dioxide that would be in our atmosphere. And then another process is lithification. And so this is when organic organisms, living organisms, make carbonate compounds. And so like organisms with shells do this. They build seashells. And so they take carbon from their bodies and then they turn it into this inorganic form, calcium carbonate, that might exist on the landscape for a really long period of time and then maybe ground up or lithified, kind of cemented together to form limestone, primarily, or other forms of rocks, and that might be trapped. The carbon then will be trapped in that form for many millions of years potentially. So fixation, combustion, and lithification are three main carbon processes. And then a fourth is weathering and dissolution. So weathering and basically dissolving of calcium carbonate happens when this lithified carbon breaks down and is released as CO2, and that CO2 might be dissolved in the water if this is happening in the ocean or in a river or stream, or it can be like straight up released as carbon dioxide into the atmosphere when this is happening on the surface. But this is as things like limestone break down. The carbon dioxide can be re-released back into the atmosphere. Okay, so we talked about trophic cascades earlier, and I'm going to link up this video about trophic cascades in carbon, but I'm not going to show it to you now, but do make a point to watch that short video. And so we're going to think about anthropogenic influences of carbon, and we know there's many. Anyone who's learned anything about carbon climate change knows that carbon is a main player. So there's different things that we're doing to influence carbon, and one of them has to do with changes to our land use. So we might be influencing the way that we're sequestering carbon by removing forests and transforming native grasslands or forests to more agricultural systems where there's much more rapid breakdown of carbon. So that's one influence. But of course, the biggest influence is this kind of technological advance that we've learned how to do over the last couple hundred years, which is to burn these old carbon compounds and take that chemical potential energy and turn it into heat energy. And then we can use that to make electrical energy or kinetic energy, mechanical energy. But the process of that releases this enormous amount of usually carbon dioxide, but could also be things like methane to the atmosphere. And so the Keeling curve, oh, it's not showing up. Weird. Anyway, the Keeling curve is this really famous graph that shows the building of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere since the late 1950s when it was starting to be measured. And I'm sorry that this is not showing up right now, but I will paste it in the view for you guys to look at this week. But basically, we have an enormous body of evidence to show that the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has been building significantly over the last, well, we know over the last while, but the Keeling curve specifically shows over the last about 6 decades. And there's some seasonality to the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, but it's definitely steadily building. And as we've talked about before, this leads to many influences in the atmosphere that we'll talk about in more detail when we talk about atmospheric pollution and climate change. Okay, that's